Kia ora, my name is James Roque. I'm an actor, comedian, writer, and director. I wrote the show Boy Mestizo, and I'm also 1/3 of the sketch group Friggin' Dangerous, bro.
Thanks for sitting with me. I created this video series as a part of Pat's new Fresh Developments program, and this is in order for me to interrogate some of the themes that I have in my play a little bit more by talking to other Filipino creatives in order to learn about their practices and their own experiences in New Zealand as Filipinos and as artists as well, in order for me to sort of learn and help in the development of my play, Sweet, Sour and Salty. Thanks for making the time today, man.
No worries. I'm glad to do it. Glad to help you out, man.
I just wanted to ask, because everyone kind of has their own story of the reason why them or their family have come to New Zealand. And I asked the same thing to Marianne and Alessa, who I talked to before, and they each had their own sort of, unique story. So what was it for your family? What was it that brought you to New Zealand?
I think for us, it was the promise of like opportunity and the promise of more opportunity for all my siblings and I. My parent.
Yeah.
Obviously, as a parent, you want the best for your kids, and and I think New Zealand is such like a good place to raise children, just because it's a land full of promises and opportunities for your kids. So I think it is just that. I remember there was an Anchor milk commercial that was airing in the Philippines at the time. That was like the kind of thing that my mum used to sell to the kids. Hey, that's where we're going. Look at this like lush green paradise.
Yeah, that's the pitch.
Yeah, so that was definitely one aspect of it. And I think as well, like, I mean, the Philippines is like has its own fair share of problems as well, whether political or whether economical or they just wanted a fresh start. I think my parents, and so they chose here.
And when you guys did arrive and sort of settle in, and what was the adjustment like? Did you think that sort of the expectations were kind of met, or like were there any troubles, or what was the general sort of first few years?
I think for us, the adjustment period was a little tough. So I remember the first week we got here, we didn't really have a house yet. So when we arrived, we all, like, my entire family for like a week were like staying in one room.
Yeah. How
And
big's your
like,
family, if you don't mind me asking? How many
there's
people at least then?
six of us.
Oh, yeah.
So 4 siblings and my parents. And so because my dad was like, lucky he had a job offer for someone, so he was able to get a job. But my my entire family was like just sleeping in one room in Pakuranga at a
Yeah.
family friend's house because we hadn't secured a house yet. So it was it was tough. And I remember in our first week here, we got robbed. Like
Really?
someone broke into the house and stole
Yeah.
a bunch of the money that my parents had brought
Oh
over.
gosh. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was shaky and it was tough. And we like when we first got here, we eventually moved to the North Shore, and we lived in Glenfield. And my dad had a car, like a second-hand car that kept like breaking down and stuff. And my mum didn't. So I remember we'd walk everywhere, like take the bus, and
Yeah.
it was definitely like a lot. And my mum as well had to like work like multiple jobs. Like I think my mum was working 2 or 3 different jobs at one point. At the same time, at one point, she was at a rest home during the day, helping at the rest home, and then I think at one point she was at KFC.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh no, she was at a rest home, and then at a bakery, and then again at the rest home doing laundry. So like she was kind
Right.
of like having to take on multiple jobs just to support the fam, just because we didn't have a really big base here. Like we kind of had to start from scratch.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it was definitely a challenging time, and not to mention like just the social pressure of like feeling like you're a bit of an outsider trying to learn the culture kind of adds even more pressure to it as well.
How old were you?
I was 8. Yeah, I was 8 years old.
Yeah. Were you sort of aware of like that of like maybe that initial lifestyle that your family was living back then, or was it only really something that kind of came to you only later on in life? Because I kind of have a similar experience where you're a kid and then you're not totally aware of the things happening, or at least in my case, my parents kind of shielded that away from me, whatever kind of struggle we were facing at the time. So how
Yeah.
aware of you at that time or at that age about it all?
Like I wasn't super aware of how tough it was back then. Like it's only in retrospect now that when I look back on it, I'm like, you know, my mum would come home late or from, working like the graveyard shift at the bakery, or like,
Yeah.
I would come home and she would be tired, and like she would ask me to like stand on her back as a kid. So she
Oh, my dad used to ask the same thing. Yeah.
yeah. So and back
Yeah.
then I'd be like, oh God, again. Oh, you'd be like, oh man, like another massage, geez. But then eventually you realize you're like, dang, like they were busting their and that's why she was like she was on her feet like most of the day. So like of course she'd have a
Yeah.
sore back, like
Yeah, true.
uh but yeah, and I think as a kid I didn't really, I didn't really have a full grasp on it. Because you don't know, you're just kind of like, oh, they're out again, like it's just me and the siblings hanging out, but like, I definitely didn't have a grasp on that. But now I look back on it, I'm like, man, there were times when I'd like ask like, why can't I have a PlayStation, or like why is my
Yeah,
game
yeah, yeah,
console
yeah, yeah.
why is my game console 2 generations behind everyone else's? Like
Yeah,
everyone's got
yeah.
PlayStation, and I've got like a fucking Sega Mega Drive, like Sega Genesis from like 1991 that we got from a garage sale. My friends from school would like come to our house, and like I'd be like, "Do you guys want to play?" And then I'd set it up, and they'd be like, "What the hell is this 16-bit shit? Like, where's your Nintendo 64? Where's your like, But I just had like all my games were like retro kind of, like
Yeah. Did they ever have the thing where it was just like they would get you the console, but then they wouldn't get any games for it? So you'd have like no games because that's what I.
nah,
All right.
they didn't give me the console. Period. Like I didn't even
Okay.
get the
Right. Yeah.
console.
Yeah. Yeah. True. True.
It was actually the first kind of like time and the first kind of sign of success, I suppose, that I can kind of remember from my parents was that my mum, they eventually got me a PS1, and they got me the mini PS1, when that small one
Yeah.
came out.
Yeah. I remember. Yeah. I had that one too.
Yeah, the PSX. So they got me that, and I remember. Sorry, no, PS and then spelt one. Like yeah,
Yeah.
so they
Yeah.
got
Yeah.
me that, and I remember, yeah, they got me that just as the PS2 was going to come out. You know what I mean? Like
All right.
so.
Yeah. Yeah. I get
I
you.
remember that being like one of the first moments where I'm like, oh, like we're getting a foothold here. Like they're actually like, we've got enough. We've got like enough to buy this now.
Yeah. With your family, steadily settling in and, finding a foot and a life within New Zealand. And you mentioned the fact that you had three other siblings, and you were a family of six. Did anything in your family dynamic change at all? Did you become closer, for example, like with your siblings, and just taking the context of, let's say you guys, like you're in this country where you're completely new to and you don't have any friends, or like maybe not
Mm.
much. I'm just assuming you didn't have many relatives, I guess, who were here before you guys. So did it bring your family closer, or you closer to your siblings? Did anything,
Well, we
was the
actually had
dynamic changed at all?
we actually had so my mom's cousin
Yeah,
and his family lived here.
right.
So they were kind of one of the first people that first family members that we had here, and I believe the children were born here.
Wow, that's
So
pretty like OG.
yeah, so when we came
Yeah.
here, they were up, my kind of family members that I hung out with that kind of knew New Zealand a little bit. So even when we went to school, I remember my cousin Austin was one of the first kind of mates that I had at school because I knew him. So that kind of helped me to make other friends. Yeah. So, but in terms of like any family dynamic change or whatever, I'd always been like very close to my sisters. Like we're all tight together. We were all mates and stuff. We were all spaced out 3 years apart from each other. And so generationally, we weren't that far apart. So when we moved here, yeah, I think it did kind of bring us together closer. You know, like even when we went to school, we all went to different schools, but after school, we would
Right.
all spend a lot of time with each other. You know, obviously that changed once my two elder sisters went to high school, because then after school
Yeah.
and high school, you'd go and do, you know, you'd loiter at the mall or whatever.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I was still in primary and intermediate. My little sister was still in primary, so we would, then that kind of became the new dynamic where my little sister and I would come home and, like, you know, watch Pokemon and Dragon Ball Z, but then my sisters would like be at the mall because they're in high school, you know. So a lot of my sister's friends that she made, my elder sister's friends, she became really tight with the Filipino community, like
Right.
the other young Filipino teens that were here when she arrived, because she was 14 when she came. She
Yeah.
was already a teenager, and so she connected with those people who were, yeah, definitely more connected with the Filipino community. And then I think as you move down in my sibling line, the more and more we were like forced to kind of erase that Filipino identity, embrace like being, like, you know, the white New Zealander narrative, and you know, like for example, my little sister came only speaking Tagalog, and then now
Mm.
she can't speak Tagalog like fluently. She can only speak English. Like, so I think the younger you are, the more pressure there is to try to fit in. Does that make sense?
You know, I get you on that, because when you're at an older age, you kind of want to go to the people that are already like yourself.
Yeah,
Whereas if you're
yeah,
younger, you're kind of caught in that really transitional phase of your life where you're still kind of gathering and trying to hold on to and try to figure out stuff. So
yeah,
yeah,
for
no,
sure.
totally get that. And
Yeah.
I want to bring it now to your practice to comedy. So what brought you to comedy? Like, what was your first experience? Like, what was the moment?
Well, the first initial thought that I was like, I'd like to give that a try, came from, I remember so one day I went to one of my friend's birthday parties, and I got like really bad food poisoning from the barbecue there. And so
Yeah.
I I was like sick. I had to stay home from school, and I was bored out of my mind, and so my mum let me go to Civic Video and rent out. Back then, they used to do, like, you know, like weekly hires for $10, you know, like, and you just get like a stack
Yeah.
of DVDs or whatever. Well, I remember renting out a DVD of Chris Rock Never Scared. I
Mm.
remember renting that DVD out and watching it through all the way through, and just laughing so much and thinking that that's quite a
Mm.
fun thing to do. I wonder if, you know, because at that point I was very good at like public speaking. Like, I love doing school speeches at
Yeah.
school. I
And
love
how
like,
old were you at that time when you saw that?
I think I was in third form. Yeah.
Right.
So, but prior to that, I was good at public speaking. I'd always get like excellence at like school speeches, and I'd won competitions at school, and I'd like,
Nice.
my mum would make me read at church. So I liked standing up in front of people and
Yeah.
talking already. And I saw that, and I kind of went, "Oh, cool! You can be funny as well." And because I've always liked, you know, I would like put silly jokes in my speeches and shit. So like, that was always my vibe.
Yeah.
So when I saw that, I was like, "Oh, cool! I didn't know that was a job. I didn't know you could do that." And I was just at the right age where I was old enough to understand the jokes in it.
Mm.
And so that kind of got me obsessed with Chris Rock, and then to the point where I was like, you know, I'd rent out his other DVDs, I'd know them off by heart, and I'd like, you know. But I was always so that's what made me interested in stand up. But I wasn't like, oh, I bet I could do this. And it
Right.
wasn't until like in high school, like later on when I was seventh form, I found out about this program called the Class Comedians Program, which is run by the Comedy Trust, and they send people out to high schools in Auckland and Wellington, and they look for potential kids who, yeah, showed potential that they could be comedians, and who
Mm.
showed interest in developing that. And I actually wasn't going to go to the workshop that they were planning, but I hadn't at the time. I was working at McDonald's, and so after school, the workshop was supposed to take place at the drama room, but I hadn't got paid yet for my job, and so my friends all went to the mall, and so I was like, I'm just gonna stick around here because I don't have
Yeah.
any money to do anything up there. So I stuck around school, and I just went to the workshop because I was like, oh, it's here, I might as well. And I gave it a go, and it was actually so it was actually Ben Hurley who kind of who's like an established New Zealand comedian, who saw my kind of audition, I suppose, and went, oh, I'd like to teach him, and so I got picked do that
Awesome.
by accident. Like I wasn't even planning on.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I did the workshop. And then at the end of that, you do like a showcase to family and friends, and that went really well. So I was like,
Nice.
fuck, I bet I could do this. But it was really funny because my first set was like, I was just me doing like a Chris Rock impression. I was just like copying everything that
Yeah.
I watched from him, but like replace black with Filipino. So and since then I've just kind of been like, oh, I love doing this.
The way that I see it, acting is different from comedy because in acting you're sort
Mm,
of playing a character. Not to say that when you do comedy, you're playing like a different version of yourself, but that's not like a fictional version. That's still a part of you. So,
mm.
what has your journey been like in sort of self-identifying, like what you want to say towards what you said about how you said you're copying Chris Rock initially, and how did you find your own sort of voice that you felt was more towards your own personality and style?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually because you say that, and it's I think the common school of thought is that they are wildly different. Like if you do stand-up comedy versus like if you're acting in a play and theater. And yes, I think obviously on paper they are very different because they have different goals or whatever, but they actually have a lot more in common than a lot of people realize.
Mm,
And this is just from doing both. um, Both require you to show a certain level of vulnerability, and if you don't have that, then people won't be able to relate to you, or people won't
mm,
be able to identify your performance as truthful. Like
mm.
they'll kind of snuff it out as showy, like
Yeah,
in the same way that, like, if you watch someone performing a character, people always often say things like, they were demonstrating something rather than being it and being truthful. It's the same in stand up. Like you can watch someone demonstrate, like do an impression of a stand up comedian. Like they can kind of
right.
they can recite their jokes and it doesn't feel like it's grounded within who they actually are. So
I get you.
a
Yeah,
very, like both, like audiences will always sniff anything that's not truthful out.
yeah,
Like if you're not being truthful about something. And so
yeah.
that's a kind of similarity that they both share. But in terms of, like, to your question, in terms of finding kind of my voice or whatever as a comedian, I think it's something that it's very common for, if you're new at something, to replicate the version of it that you've seen work. Like if you're like, well, I have no reference to what a good comedian is, I'm just going to do what I think it is from what I've seen before, right? So a lot of comedians actually go through that, and it isn't until like maybe 4 or 5 years into your career where you realize what you can bring to the table. What you can bring to your work. But I think the biggest thing for me was realizing that as a comedian, your strength lies in your own unique voice,
Mm,
and it lies in how much you can stand out compared to everyone else. So, for example, as a comic, you learn very quickly that if you don't stand out, or if you don't have, something that makes you unique or gives you a point of difference, you'll just get lost, and you'll get lost in a lineup show. You'll get lost in, on a page when you're trying to get booked, like where people are picking, on endless like headshots. You're
mm.
just going to get lost and you're not going to work. So it forces you to find what your unique angle is on life. When you think about like everyone's favorite comedians, they've all got a thing. Like they've all got their voice and their thing that they say. So I think for me, a big time realization was realizing that my thing was what being a Filipino New Zealander means and what that perspective means. It's not necessarily that I only talk about that, but it's
Mm.
that everything I see and everything that I interact with in life is through that lens. And so it's just going, how can I share that perspective with everyone? When I kind of realized that, that's when there was a big shift in my, not only in my writing but in my career as well, because then I
Yeah,
realized, oh, this is how I can stand out in the lineup. Like this is how I can be different to everyone, and
yeah.
how people can go when they come and see me and they leave my show, they go, I learned more about that person. Like I feel like I know
Mm,
them a lot better.
mm.
all comics go through that, you know.
Mm.
All the comics that keep working anyway, and
Yeah.
that are still finding somewhat of success go through that.
How do you think someone can more fully realize what's authentic to them in terms of their voice and in their craft? Like, how do you think, what are some actionable things or ways of approaching their art or their
Mm,
craft to finding authenticity within your voice as opposed to
mm.
attaching yourself onto something that's already been done or that you've seen and you're emulating it? You know, how do you think you can start separating yourself from that?
I think for me anyway, personally, what I found worked was bringing more of myself and my personality and my thoughts and my heart or soul or whatever into my
Yeah,
work. And so people often talk about how, like, if you're a comic, it's so personal being a comedian and watching a comedian because they are telling you there's not like they're not pulling from any, they're just pulling from their own head and they're like their own sort of experiences. And so I think for me, the best way to find that voice is to put little bits of yourself in your work. You
yeah,
know, I find that that's why I think it's a lot harder as well for a lot of creatives and writers and stuff to separate life from their art because it requires so much from you. Even if you're writing something that isn't necessarily like autobiography or like something that has your own personal experiences in it, you can't help but bring your voice, like your own perspectives into things. So I think for me, like I always say, you can make sort of statements on stage as a comedian, and people could be like, "Oh, that's a generalization, or that's not true," you know, whatever. That's not true. But if you say, "But this is what I experienced. This is what I
yeah.
saw," then they can't say, "Oh, that's not true." Well, it was your experience, and you're
Mm.
just sharing it with people. It's not like you're making a generalization about stuff. So
Yeah, and you'll
that's kind
feel
of
it,
what I've
right? When
done.
it's authentic, like you'll feel it. You'll sort of
Yeah,
have the instinct that says, yeah, this is me. This is finally kind of the things that I want to say. And I've, at least for myself, I've found that the instinct pops up when I know that it's authentic.
and that's not necessarily to say that everything you have to make has to come from a place where you're sharing your most deepest, darkest
Yeah.
secrets. I think that there's a trap where a lot of people kind of fall into, "Oh, I need to share my pain in order for art to be
Yeah.
good." And
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
necessarily, man. Sometimes you can share joy, you know. Sometimes you can share things that you're kind of curious about. It's just whatever your perspective is. But yeah, I think there is kind of a temptation to then make everything like, "This is how hard my life is,"
Mm.
because I think
Yeah. 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 The
there's a time and
pain.
place for everything. Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
time and place for
Yeah.
everything,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
not everything has to be like a tortured artist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. With your writing, with comedy and your jokes and your skits and so forth. What's your process of that? Like, just in a sort of literal, practical standpoint. Like, are you sort of at a table with a notebook? What's your process like? And how do you form your jokes? And how do you steadily develop that? Is that through sort of taking them on stage a couple times and doing that live in that way, or how do you formulate your own ideas? From start to finish, on a
Um,
craft level.
I try to go about my life and say if I'm like writing a show and I know I'm trying to write, new hour or whatever. I'm like currently working on jokes. I
Mm,
always do this thing where I just try to live my life as I do, and I have like this kind of thoughts swirling in my head of ideas and stuff. But I always try to open my senses or my receptors a bit
mm,
more to, I'm like a bit more sensitive to stuff. Like I
mm,
try to absorb things more like a sponge, where I kind of go, "Hey, that was funny. Is there anything in that?" Something happens, someone says something, I see something happen, and if I've got those receptors open, I'm kind of like try to take that in. I then put it through like a little filter in my head, going, "Is there anything in that? Does that make me laugh?" Because that's, I think, for me, the first thing I go, "Does that make me laugh? Like, is
mm,
that funny?" And if there is, I have a little notebook in my phone, an app. I write a little note in my phone, just a little one note sentence, and then I will go to like, then yeah, I'll sit down with my notebook, and then I'll go through my notes on my phone, and I'll go through anything that I that I wrote down, and I see if it's still funny after like if it's
Yeah.
still funny after like 2 weeks, and if it is, then
Yeah.
I'll be
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
there's something more, and then I then try to write it out. I don't write it word for word anymore. I used to when I first started, but I think
Yeah.
now I'm able to just write the bullet points or the punchlines and the potential offshoots and stuff. And then and once I have something, then I think the only way to do it is to try it out on stage. So I'll try it out like at an open mic or like at a new material night at the Classic. Yeah, and it's so funny because even once you've written a joke, and there's jokes that I do that I've done on TV that have been recorded already that I'm still working on, like, that I'm still like
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
to this day, like I'm still kind of chipping away at it. Yeah, so I'll then try get it up on its feet, and this is where a lot of the vulnerability comes from as a comedian. Is like you have to be ready to learn that sucked, that there was nothing in that, without taking it
Mm.
personally, and just going it's just part of the craft. Like sometimes you sometimes things just fall flat, and you have to be able to be prepared to
Mm.
either keep working on it, and if it still doesn't work, then let it go, or just drop it then and there, and just know
Yeah.
that it doesn't reflect badly on you as a person, or it doesn't
Yeah.
like
Definitely.
diminish your self worth.
Do you ever
You
have
know,
a block, like a sort of writer's block, or
yeah,
is that a
100%.
similar thing for comedy? Like you have a type of writer's block stuff. Like if you're trying to work on it, it's like no new ideas will come. Or for example, when you're in that phase of gathering things, nothing
Mm.
comes, this type of thing.
Yeah,
Do you
oh,
experience that?
100%. Yeah, it's truly. I mean, I'm only sound really comfortable, and I only sound super like chill about it now, just because I'm not currently like 1 month away from a show trial
Yeah,
opening. You know, like
yeah, yeah,
uh, it's very like very anxiety inducing. That this whole thing of like doing a show, then throwing it out, and having to find new things, like to have like to try to come up with like a new hour every 1 or 2 years is like a daunting like task. And I think what helps it is that you just take it a bit at a time. You know, like you go, all right, I'm going to write a new 10 minutes, and I'm going to write a new 15, new 20, and eventually you get to 40, and you've got your hour, and then eventually sometimes you even go 1 hour 30, and then you've got to chop it down and choose the best parts, which I think is a good position to be in. But yeah, it's really scary. Um,
yeah,
but and so that writer's block can sometimes, it comes, and then you just eventually you reach a point where you've done it enough. Like I've been doing comedy for 10 years, so I've like kind of developed tactics to break me out of that. You know,
mm,
whether it's like doing a workshop, like a mini kind of table workshop group with other comics to kind of just bounce ideas around and just kind of shake the snow globe around a
yeah,
bit in your head. Whether it's that or it's like I do this thing where I write down questions and I try to answer them. Like
yeah,
questions like what makes me mad? What do I love? What do I wish there was more of in life? What makes me curious? What makes me confused? What don't I understand and I wish I understood? And so you answer those things. Eventually, you find your voice and you find things in them, and then eventually they become talking points, and then you can kind of start writing there.
awesome, man. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind in the future as well. And
Actually, yeah, it
yeah,
does. It helps a
and
lot.
yeah, yeah. And with your show, Boy Mestizo, what was the process of creating that? Sort of like before any of it was written, or you had, even the first thought of the first joke that was a part of it. Was it triggered by, a decision of, okay, I'm gonna write a show that is, um, Filipino essentially, and something maybe a bit more closer to home? Was that a conscious choice, or did it just end up being that way? So how did you
Um,
start go about creating that show?
so I think for me, it was a bit of a two-step thing. It was twofold. The first thing that kind of set everything up was so Chai Ling actually bought me as a present a book called Little Big Man
Mm.
by Alex Nizon, who's a Filipino American journalist who actually passed away a couple of years ago now. But
Oh, right.
the book is a autobiographical slash um, like investigation, I suppose, and an interrogation of what it means to be an Asian American, and specifically for his lens, a Filipino American. And there was a chapter in it that I remember reading one night and just really being that like just hit me like a ton of bricks. It was a chapter in which he talks about his father when he was a child. One of his strongest memories of his father was how his father taught him to pinch his nose to try to make it pointier, and he just kind of broke down how that's like a really strong sign that this, the Filipino diaspora is still struggling with their identity post colonization, because they were still trying to make themselves look more Spanish. Um,
Yeah.
and so, and that hit me like a ton of bricks because that's happened to me. And then I started to reflect on what other things kind of in my life were remnants of that. And it's things like not being told you can't go outside because your skin might get too dark, and when it's too sunny, by my parents, and then the nose thing, and then, hearing the word mestizo be thrown around when I was a kid, and then looking into what that means. And then that kind of just set like a chain of events, which made me like look deeper into my past, and
Mm,
unpack things that I'd never even considered to be harmful to my own self-worth.
right.
So that was kind of the first step. And then coincidentally, my girlfriend at the time, currently still, my girlfriend was traveling around Europe, and she kind of proposed this idea that, on my way home, why don't I meet you somewhere in Southeast Asia? And I was like, oh, why not the Philippines? Because I'd never been back.
Yeah.
I'd never been back there since moving here. And she's like, yeah. And so it's just on a whim, I bought this flight to Manila to go on like this mini holiday with her. And then when I went back there, I met my family that I haven't seen in like 20 years.
Whoa. Yeah.
And I've got all these like family members who looked like me, but they were strangers. It was
Mm,
so weird. It was such a weird feeling. And
mm,
so, yeah. And so kind of interrogating how I felt about that, like how I felt about being a Filipino who felt like a white dude in the Philippines, who felt like I was out of place. And yeah, and so and when I was there, I saw remnants of the stuff that I was already thinking about like all the, all the post-colonial sort of stuff and all the hangovers. And I saw ads for skin whitening creams, billboards, and
mm,
I heard my aunties saying, complimenting people for having light skin. My grandma complimented my girlfriend for having white skin, like light skin, because she's white.
mm,
and
mm.
and it like, yeah, and it kind of just became two things that were swirling around in my head at the time, just kind of met together. And when I came home, I had, I didn't really set out and go, I'm going to write the show about this. Like, I just kind of had all these things to unpack still. And around that time, the comedy festival was like, hey, we're taking applications for shows, blah, blah, blah. And so that was what was on my mind at the time. And so that's what I ended up writing about. It didn't happen like, it just kind of happened organically. I wasn't like, now I'm going to do my Filipino
Yeah, you
show.
weren't
It's like,
like,
well,
okay, the next thing, yeah, and draw it out on like a map. Okay, I'm gonna do this and this and
yeah.
this. So it was just organic.
It's just kind of like what was in my head at the time, and where I was at with my journey of like trying to reclaim who I was. And so that's where it ended up. This would fall in the category of what are things that I wish I understood better, or what are some things that I wish I knew more about. And because it was like, I wish I understood the reasons for why my parents told me to not get dark outside. That would, be an answer to that. Or I wish that I knew more about Filipino history, which I learned for the show. So that's why I go back to those questions, because I go, they're really helpful, because it then informs what you write as something that's connected to you.
It's really great to hear how it all just came about organically and how it was sort of just a product of you already thinking about certain things about yourself and about your history and your past, and that, just being a product of that rather than something of like, okay, I'm going to map this whole thing out and it's going to be this and this and this and this and this. That was all sort of just natural, you kind of just going throughout your own life and, thinking
Yeah.
your own thoughts. Thanks for sitting down and talking to me. I feel like I've learned so much about, not just about yourself, but just as an artist and as a writer of how to approach and look at different things and different aspects. So thanks for sharing all of your little words of advice and tidbits. Really appreciate it, man.
Hey, no worries, man. The biggest takeaway would just be If you just do you and write what you feel, then you can't really get it wrong. Like, if as long as there's enough of you in whatever you make.